Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of The Logic Files. This is episode number 3 for the 2nd of August, 2025. I am way unprepared. So first of all, let me apologize for being late. Actually, first of all, let me say I tweaked the setting on the volume on my mic in Windows. I didn't realize the volume seems like it's been turned down for the last couple of episodes, so in the chat, if the mic is too loud, let me know, please, and I'll adjust it. Second of all, really apologize for being late. Lesson learned: don't eat spicy food all day. I started off this morning eating a spicy noodle from the Thai noodle place, and then had leftover spicy Indian food much later in the day than I probably should have. So, but we're all good now, and I think I'll be good to get through a full episode. And then the third apology that I need to make is I am significantly less prepared than I normally am, and so we're going to kind of be going off the cuff a little bit tonight, which might be more enjoyable for some people than the kind of clinical approach that I have to a lot of this. I don't have banners and all that stuff made for tonight, so we'll just go with the flow and go over some of these topics. So actually the first one that I want to get into is I've been talking a lot this week, obviously, about the new job posting on PlayStation and what it means and what some people think it means and what I personally think it means, and have had opportunity to talk with a lot of people about their theories. And, I want to put out the disclaimer, as I think I do most of the time, that, I'm just not really a person who's really that much into, making predictions and standing by them in terms of feeling that it matters at all, whether or not you were right or wrong, or doing victory laps or keeping score. It's just not, who I am. At the end of the day, none of us are omniscient, so anything that we do is making a guess. You're welcome to go back to 11 years or more of Enough to Keep Going and the Gamers podcast and all the shows I've been on, and go over all my blogs and yada yada yada. And I'm pretty sure you're gonna never see me anywhere saying never, just because, one, I'm an engineer first, and I probably never say never. But I will often, comment on, whether or not something makes sense to me or whether or not I've figured something out. And that's an admission that, from the data that I have, I may not know how a thing makes sense. And obviously, if a corporation chooses to do something, that's probably because of data that they have that I don't have. A very good example of that is I often talk to people who, to other technology, people who are into tech, and they will often talk about how, Microsoft is removing this feature or that feature. And one of the things is Microsoft is incredibly good at telemetry, right, from all the years that they've spent providing Windows services for the vast majority of the world. And so if Microsoft is pulling a feature out of Windows, it's because they have the telemetry that tells them that nobody's using it, right? So, and so while it may not make sense to me that they're pulling a feature, it probably absolutely makes sense to them because they have access to data more so than I do. So we're going to start off tonight with one aspect of this topic. I've had an opportunity today to think through several more facets of this whole thing, and it also goes into some things about with Microsoft earnings and whatnot. But one of these things is about porting PlayStation games to Xbox, and which games will go and what platforms they'll go to. And so I'll start with this article. I'm kind of picking articles at random tonight because I actually didn't have articles on the agenda. But I'll start with this one tonight. Rumor more PlayStation games are coming to Xbox, which was run yesterday on Game Rant by Viraj Bhatnagar. Sony is reportedly preparing to bring more PlayStation games to Xbox consoles, according to a reliable insider. While no PlayStation game has been announced for Xbox beyond Helldivers 2, this report might allude to a significant turning point in how Sony approaches exclusivity in the years ahead. Historically, Sony has been fiercely protective of first-party games with tentpole franchises, which is the Sony term. There's a different term that I use, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. with tentpole franchises like God of War, Uncharted, Horizon, The Last of Us, and more remaining locked to PlayStation consoles for most of their lifespans. However, Sony has gradually warmed up to multi-platform publishing, beginning with PC ports of select first-party games in 2020, and most recently, the surprise announcement that Helldivers 2 will launch on Xbox Series XS on August 26th. This set off speculation about a potential major shift in Sony's exclusivity strategy. And then obviously this gets into then we have the job posting. Thanks, nerds. By the way, yeah, I apologize. Thanks so much, Soil Tech and Ghostface Killa and nerds in the chat. And thanks so much, because I know some of you guys were here early at the time that I said I was going to go live and hung on to wait for me to get through, my stomach settling down and all that. So I can't express how much that means that you guys showed up on a Saturday night, because obviously I had to push this show to the right one day to leave room for Forte and Slow Mo doing DPS. But it's huge that you guys felt like this discussion would be of enough value to hang around and eat into your schedules. So thanks so much. And no nerds, you wound up not being late. And so this refers to these tweets from Nate the Hate, right? And I don't know why I closed my own Twitter tab, because we'll definitely go back to that. But Nate has mentioned it's been very curious, right? Hey, Nate, thanks so much for coming through the chat. We appreciate you. It's been very curious to see how different people are handling different aspects of this information. And obviously this gets into tribalism and camps and platform preferences. That's a lot of what the theme this week has been. And so from what I've seen, people have cherry-picked Nate's tweets depending on which narrative or agenda they want to push, including major news outlets who have reported on Nate's tweets and carried it as a news story, choosing to report when he said that more games were coming to PlayStation, but then not following up when he said, well, I think it's just live service games or it's smaller games. I don't know anything about like any major, like these tentpole franchises that we talk about going over. So this leads me to like the first aspect of this that I want to get into, which is some theories that I've heard from other people. And I am going to talk about other things that I've talked about with other people, but I don't think I'm going to try not to go down the road of like points of contention or arguments that we've had, since they're not here to defend themselves. That's not really the point of these. This is more about, I talked to them, they offered an idea, I didn't agree with that idea, but that discussion caused me to think of like another angle or another facet of this that I hadn't articulated. And so one of those things is, the thought that PlayStation games will be going to Xbox Gen 9 consoles. A large part of my thought of what games are going to go and when and why has oriented around this theory that, so first of all, it's 2025, and I heard, Nate, that you mentioned this the other night, that yeah, I'm gonna try not to be messy tonight. It's going to be hard not to. But Nate, I heard you mention on Brap's show last night that hey, it's look at the timeline and look at where we are in the generation, and like, does it make sense? Unless things are in pipeline now, like ready to go, does it make sense? Like, let's start with the assumption that they're not, right? Does it make sense to push games to an Xbox Series X or S like in 2 years, right, when they're probably about to launch, right, the next console or next device, like whatever that is? And so that caused me to think, and so I thought predominantly that whatever they're planning to do, it's about the future, right? It's not about the current generation, it's about whatever's coming next. And a lot of the popular thinking about what's coming next is that the next thing will be some type of Xbox PC hybrid that will run an operating system that is much closer to the desktop version of Windows 11 versus the cut down version of Windows 11 or Windows 10, actually, that the current Xbox consoles run, and so that it will essentially be a PC. And what I've said is, at that point, it's going to have Steam and the Epic Games Store, and I assume good old games on it. And at that point, I've said, well, those games are going to wind up on that device anyway. Would it not make sense for PlayStation? And I've never agreed. And I know there are lots of people, lots of good people who I respect, who have a theory that PlayStation will block its games going onto that device. I haven't agreed with that. The ones that I have extreme pushback for are the people who don't understand anything technical and have come up with, quite frankly, just a lot of lame brain and ideas about how that would work. And that's what they've advertised to people will happen. And I'm like, maybe you guys shouldn't be trying to comment on like the specific technical implementation, and just say that you think that they're going to block the games on the console, on the hybrid PC. I don't think they're going to try and block it. But at any rate, my point is that if those games are going to be there because they're coming over from Steam or the Epic Games Store, then it just makes sense to maybe also offer them via the Windows Store, because the revenue share there is better. It's 88-12 versus Steam's 70-30. And so I'm like, well, why would you just not cover down on the thing? And then that would also then make sense to me that those job titles that are there would say Xbox and PC, because at that point they kind of mean the same thing, despite whatever Xbox's branding thing is that they're trying to do. So regardless of the timeline, and Nate has a comment here that I want to bring up, and says, yeah, it all depends on what Xbox actually ends up doing at the end of the day, right? And so this topic of, are they going to the Series X and Series X and Series S consoles? One aspect that I think should be considered is that if you're thinking that PlayStation is going to put games on Gen 9 consoles, then that means that it's going to the Series S. And now you're dealing with a hardware target that has fewer resources, and you're talking about the company doing that has said, you're talking about the company doing that, and you're talking about a first party studio, right? You're not talking about Arrowhead doing it, because that's a different thing, and that's different resource management, and that publishing arrangement of getting that game onto Xbox works differently, right, in terms of LOE, level of effort, staffing, funding, schedule, support, etc. You're talking about a first-party studio doing a thing that the company decided they wouldn't do themselves when they went to market with their own console, which is PlayStation saying that they weren't going to do multiple SKUs of a baseline that had differing compute resources, right? PlayStation deliberately, definitively, consciously said at the beginning of the generation, prior to the launch, rather, we're not going to take the same route that Xbox is doing. We're not going to make a smaller console that's weaker, and have developers have to contend with that. We're just going to do that. So it would just be kind of weird to me that they would do that themselves in their own development pipeline when they specifically chose not to do that for their own hardware baseline. So a couple of things like to consider, right, is this notion that people who are thinking that first party games are coming to Gen 9 consoles. I mean, so what does Spider-Man 2 on the Series S look like when it's upscaled at 4K and running at 30 frames per second? I don't necessarily know that that's something that intuitively resonates with me that PlayStation would want to do. What does TLU 2, right, on the Series S at 1440p look like running at 30 frames per second? So, what does quality mode on a Series S for those types of games look like? I think those present significant challenges, and that there's things to overcome. Now, I know that there will be a crowd that will say, porting's easy. It's not that hard. How difficult it is to get things onto the Series S isn't as bad as people say it is. It's lazy devs. And I mean, that's fine if you have that perspective. My point is it's not zero. It's not zero level of effort, right? In moving things to Gen 9 means, and this is what I kind of wish about the job rec. The job rec is for account managers, and I kind of talked about last episode what account managers are. They're really like administrative people. They're handling things like revenue payouts, financial tracking. There are people who have to be experts on like the publishing agreements, right, and all the requirements that have to be followed when you go to put a game on Steam or go to put a game on Xbox. They're actually the type of people, for instance, when PlayStation got heat because it pushed Helldivers 2 to regions where you can't operate the PlayStation network while concurrently requiring the PlayStation network. Those are the type of people who are supposed to know those types of things, right? So those gaffes don't happen. So Nerd said, I don't follow. Why would that be weird? Spider-Man and Miles Morales are on PS4. I don't see why it would be a problem for Series S unless I'm not understanding what you mean. Yeah, they're on PlayStation 4 within the PlayStation ecosystem, right? So my point is that I don't necessarily think that it's absolutely intuitive that they would take on targeting a piece of hardware that's outside their ecosystem, which presents to them a greater development challenge that they chose, right? That they essentially chose not to take on themselves. But they may do it. I'm not saying that they won't do it. I'm just saying that it represents a challenge and it's not zero. Going back to the job rec, I wish what we had visibility on and what would be more significant to me is that I don't really care about the account managers. What I really care about is engineers, right? Engineers, developers, program managers, project managers, program directors, that type of thing. If you're going to take this on to put things on Gen 9 console, and like I'm saying, the LOE is not zero, that means either more people or extended schedules. But my point is those resources have to come from somewhere. And as far as I know, I could be wrong. I don't know that Sony is in or that PlayStation is in a hiring disposition right now. After layoffs, I haven't seen any. I mean, they've had job recs open, but I haven't seen an indicator that they're doing a big staffing up, retooling their pipeline, retooling their utilities, doing the things that it takes to take on the job of porting these to an additional piece of hardware, and in particular, right, doing hardware optimization to get it onto the Series S. Nerd says, I feel like all Sony games on PC could be on Series S. I would imagine they are already scalable to lower specs. Yeah, so that's possible. The other aspect of this that I considered, that I was thinking about was, PlayStation already has a challenge, as they've seen this generation, that they have to support cross-generational software. So you go back to the very beginning of this generation. So Innate says, it's not about scalability. He was just talking about the effort. Gamers underestimate the cost, dev time, and effort to port games, largely because they base it on a multi-platform third-party companies. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So and I think my overall point that I'm trying to make, nerds, is that there's additional baggage, right? I think when people talk about, hey, those games are going to Xbox, to the Gen 9 consoles, they don't think about the challenge that the Series S presents. And while I understand that there are some commonalities and some overlap with going to PC, we do have developers who say that they won't do Series S, or that Series S presents a significant challenge to them, and a specific additional level of effort that's required to optimize for that hardware to get their games onto that device, and then to constantly do the operations and maintenance and updates and bug fixes and all those things that support them for that additional console. So the other aspect of this that I was thinking of is, and again, this, my point is that I'm bringing up a thing that is another thing. This is another thing that I think people often strangely wildly extrapolate. I'm not saying they won't go to Gen 9 consoles because, oh my God, the sky is falling and the Series S is the death knell of anybody who I'm not saying that, right? I'm saying this is another challenge that people haven't thought of, and that hasn't been articulated in a lot of the arguments for, right, this case that I hear. One of the other thoughts I considered is PlayStation has a challenge now that they have to be cross-generational. If you go back to the beginning of the generation, right, one of Jim Ryan's statements was, we believe in console generations. And then 2, 3, 4, or 5 years into the generation, that optimistic outlook turned out to not be the thing that was really going to work for them, right? That they had a lot of people on PlayStation 4, that I think that they still have people on PlayStation 4 spending money. which is why they continued putting titles on PlayStation 4. One of the things that also while we're talking about this, that often gets left out of the conversation, let's also remember that they've stopped developing for PlayStation 4. So yes, there are earlier games that are on PlayStation 4, but in general, the messaging that has been sent to us is that they've stopped developing for PlayStation 4, and that from what I feel like I've heard from that messaging is that they have tooled the pipeline, right? Utilities, desktop tools, development frameworks to target moving beyond the PlayStation 4, right? But early in this generation, they had that as a challenge, right? They have to be cross-generational. They're probably thinking that they're going to have to do that again. And again, that's just additional effort, right? If you go into Gen 10 thinking that you've got to support the PlayStation 6, the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 5 Pro, which is a very skinny, like narrow lane, but still it's a thing, and to potentially support a handheld, and you're going to put games on the Gen 9 consoles, which is now yet another cross-generational challenge, and tack the Series S onto that. I think, again, there's just a lot of things that haven't been considered, right, when people have their theories and their optimistic outlooks. But I would mention that calculus has already been made by Sony, hence the multi-platform effort, and ultimately, yeah, we definitely should make the effort. And I mean, where I'm going to land on that, nerds, is I think that's a matter of perspective and opinion. I think some people have pushed the I believe button that, there's this large, significant multi-platform effort, and my personal perspective is there's a very methodical, triage, narrow multi-platform effort, right? That does not involve taking on the challenge of taking high-performing titles and putting them on, what will be in a couple of years last generation hardware, in particular ones that have limited compute resources. And you're right. I don't disagree with you that some of that calculus has already been done. I think the disagreement we have is I think the calculus has yielded where are we going to do things that do the most for us, and where are we going to not take on challenges in LOE that don't necessarily make the most sense for us, and involve more lift than is needed to do some other things. E8 says, PlayStation hasn't said anything yet outside of live service titles as of this moment, so we will see. So going back to the thing of the PlayStation 4, so they've stopped development on the PlayStation 4. They've had to support it longer into this generation than they have had to support the previous generation console historically. And that's probably, my guess is that's probably longer than they would have preferred to have supported that SKU. One thing, though, that they also had that'll be different this next generation, part of what caused the requirement to support the last generation consoles were also the supply shortages that the entire world experienced, supply chain shortages, right, as part of the pandemic. We won't have that next time around. So we may see a conversion that happens faster, particularly for people who bought consoles in the earlier part of the generation. Now, part of that is that's not the whole story, right? There were supply shortages, but there are obviously black hole games, right, in this whole theory that people play black hole games. You don't need high-performing hardware to play Fortnite. If you play Fortnite, you can just play Fortnite forever and stay on your old hardware. So that's certainly part of the equation. I will say one thing that I will call into question is Matt Piscatella, when he was on Kind of Funny Games Daily, I think in February, and he rattled off the stats in his discussion with Greg Miller, said that on Xbox and PlayStation, players spend 40% of their time in the top 10 live service games, and for some reason, as of late, people have been saying 50%. So I'm not sure where the 50% comes from. Maybe that comes from another news update or something that I missed. But I feel like this is this thing where we pick a percentage and then we slowly start upping that percentage, right, conversationally as we continue to talk about the topic, because that aligns with kind of what we're predicting. But the number I heard was 40%. Nerds says, I think we should believe Sony when they say they are making an effort. What approach angle they take and how they tackle the strategy, that part is about. And I think that's the point, nerds. I don't think anybody's saying they're not going to put games on Xbox. I think the discussion is about how are they going to put those games on Xbox? What games are they going to put on Xbox? When are they going to put them Xbox? And what Xboxes they're putting them on? And like I said, I don't think the thing that you're bringing up now is really what the points of disagreement are. I think the points of disagreement are between people who are taking extreme parts of the spectrum, right? People who are saying everything's going, right? Versus people who are saying nothing but live services going. And as is the typical problem in the gaming conversation with the high signal to noise ratio that happens because of entrenchment in platforms, those of us who are trying to have very granular, very nuanced conversations in the middle get drowned out, right? To the point that nobody can hear. So when I say something like, I don't believe that first party games of marquee IP from S tier studios are going. Number one, that's my initial perspective. That if they do go, I don't see them going on anything other than the 15 to 24 month delay in which they go to PC, and I believe that they will land on an Xbox under that delay. If the next Xbox is an Xbox hybrid PC, whereby those games would wind up there anyway on Steam, right? That's my articulation of kind of how I would expect it to go down. But like I said, the conversation like that level of granularity tends to get drowned out by the people who are insisting that everything's going versus the people who are insisting nothing is going, as well as the people who are concerned about who's giving the most crap right to both sides and who needs to take revenge for, PlayStation people calling, Xbox, third party and multi-platform a year ago. So it's just the shortages were insane. People try to downplay it now, but I know people that struggle to get a PS5 even a year and a half out. Yeah, and I mean, I've often talked about this generation was going to be the lost generation, that you're just going to have people who are just not going to move. That, they waited so long to be able to get a PlayStation 5. And what I mean by, and again, for instance, when I talked about the Ryzen 9070 XT, right, I would say things like, these things are hard to get. They're not an ample supply. It's a pain in the butt to go get them. And I would constantly get back the reports of like, oh, well, there were 197 XTs at Micro Center, this Friday. I'm like, time out. Like the entire world does not live in proximity to a Micro Center, right? And even if you do live in proximity to it, like I have a Micro Center 60 miles away, right? But it's a super pain in the butt to get there, right? Over an interstate, paying for the expressway, in a high density urban population area that like I would never go there, right, unless I took like a half day off. So like those caveats that they were easy to get, and lots of people even during the beginning of the console generation were like, well, hey, all you have to do is this. But what we need to recognize is like everybody doesn't want to do that. Everybody doesn't. I was in a disposition where I was working from home. I had the Amazon app, on my phone. I was able to hit refresh, right, and go back and get these consoles. But like not everybody is that into gaming. Not everybody wants to go through that. Lots of people will go to a store and try and get a thing, and if they can't get a thing, they'll close the app and walk away. I mentioned earlier this week, like part of the problem with the conversation is always that we, the gaming community and the market are two different things, right? The gaming community on social media is a very, very incredibly small, I would almost say infinitesimal single-digit percentage number of the market. And the way we talk about things and the way the market behaves are vastly different. So goes fix it. I live there. The industry is changing. When is the industry not changing? Yeah, I often get pushed back on that, and I say the industry has been changing since it came into inception in 1972. We've changed through microtransactions. We've changed through the rise of digital. We've changed to the hegemony of PC gaming and hitting the point where PC games were pulled off of retail shelves, right? And this industry really became about consoles, right? And then we've changed once again to where the industry, admittedly the part of the industry that most of us don't pay attention to, really became about mobile. And we've also seen the rise in the recession of mobile, right? In terms of, we often forget and leave out of the conversation that these companies went hard in the paint to go down the path of mobile, and then were dissatisfied with what they got out of mobile, right? And have largely wrapped up those efforts as key major components of their strategy, right? Nintendo did that. PlayStation, experimented with mobile, and all of them have said, we'll do toe dips into that area, but we're not going hard in the paint down that path, because this notion that there's explosive growth available there, and people always talk about, that's the biggest part of the market, and there's explosive growth, and it's like, again, if you're not a company tooled around making Candy Crush, right, then mobile probably isn't the thing for you as much as people say it is. Nerd says, my comment is response to the general idea that it's too much effort unless I'm not understanding the chat. Again, I think my point is that it's not too much effort, the decision, but it is more effort than not doing it. And the decision has to be made, and the ROI evaluation has to be made about whether or not that makes sense for the business, right? Whether or not it's a big major muscle movement that provides enough returns and enough advantage, or whether or not it's small and kind of irrelevant, and the gains are much greater than the work that gets put in. I feel it's often a conversation that gets blown by, right, in the conversation, which is why I pointed that stuff out. I think the effort thing that's being lost is it's not just effort when porting a game. And he says, we are fundamentally talking about destroying your own brand or making moves strategically, and I don't think PlayStation is at the former and are remaining at the latter. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit too, Nate. So my point on that was, the latter part of that point of that was that cross-gen is already a problem for PlayStation that PlayStation has to figure out, right? Just even within their own ecosystem, much less somebody else's ecosystem. It's a drag. It's going to be a drag on production pipeline output because it's more level of effort. And so in order to compensate, you'd either need more people or more teams divvying up the work in logical segregated manners. I think a big part of things that are not understood about software development too, and I constantly point back to this colloquialism that those of us in the domain often quote from Fred Brooks, who wrote, 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month, right? It's not a matter of just staffing up and adding more people. It's, can the work be logically divided amongst individual teams so that you can maintain the schedule and maintain velocity to a point of convergence where components are ready, concurrently for integration, and then you're able to deliver the product. And so that is another part, right, of the thing that has to be figured out in the way PlayStation is tooling things. PlayStation structure right now for porting, and this is another reason why I would feel more convinced if I saw and understood what movements were happening on the engineering side. PlayStation's current production pipeline framework and tooling for porting things, because they've only ported to PC so far, mostly talking about from internal effort. First party is to do handoffs to this tier 2 level of production. I'll refer to it as that. That involves Nix's Bluepoint and an Iron Galaxy. Is that the same way they're going to put games over on Xbox? If it is, those 3 studios have got to do something. They either have to increase staffing or they've got to take on more projects, which is going to slow down the cadence and the release pace of getting games everywhere. So I don't know what that plan is, but the suggestion that like the multi-platform strategy is going to be major would help to be corroborated if I knew what that looked like, or if I knew like what the plan was to outsource that more or what. So hopefully we'll at some point see that information, which I think will kind of help us kind of understand what that plan, our intention is. Okay, I think that covers that. So as we continue on, we'll get more and more off the cuff because that's kind of everything. That's everything that I had time to put together, like preliminary notes or like beyond handwritten notes. So we'll probably just stay on this topic and see how much we get into news. Yeah, so the next topic I want to get into is kind of talking about and thinking about, right, and definitely encourage members of the chat to participate, is what does the landscape of the industry look like when all 3 consoles are significantly more expensive? And so you look at Xbox earnings, and I'm going to try and I know I'm going to find something pretty quick, but I'm hoping I find something that splits out at least their comment. In fact, I'm going to go to the Microsoft investor site. So again, sorry, didn't have this stuff prepped beforehand. But what I want to take a look at is the slides, because the slides are always what I look at. That I don't think so. They never report how much they made on hardware, but they do often talk about how much they made in software. Yeah, I think a lot of people are still reading into the job posting, not realizing it's been confirmed. It was a position that was already in place, and someone left the company, not a new initiative. And I know I saw a comment today that like, oh well, it's not that one person. It's additional roles. They're putting together a whole team. And I'm like, so again, to me, this is just my perspective, right? From working in a software development space. 3 or 4 account managers is not a big deal. Like 3 or 4 account managers is not a team. It's not even enough to play a 5-on-5 basketball game, right? Again, where I would feel like something big or major were happening was if I saw a bunch of engineering recs, right, that were hiring developers to to work on porting games to DirectX or work on porting games to Xbox or some program manager jobs or project manager jobs. That would kind of be more convincing to me about, or give me more tea leaves to read on like how big of an effort we're talking about. I think I got the Q4 slides. I'm really trying to find the fiscal year FY25. Maybe the slides get into that. Like I said, what I'm really looking for is the split. Sorry, I'll bring these up. I'm really looking for the split, some commentary on how much they made in software. That's really what this discussion topic is really oriented around. So I'll bring up the FY25 or the Q4 reporting slides, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about Microsoft MPC versus PlayStation G&NS, because I think that's another thing that kind of gets twisted out there. More personal computing. So they talk about they do have that's at the divisional level. So I got into an argument, as is often the case, with a person on Twitter who claimed, and I'm just going to say directly lied, about being a Sony investor, claiming that there was a shareholder proxy vote to put games on other platforms back in June, and that they all voted for it. So in the context of that conversation, I think the things that I was trying to point out to this person about the differences about how Microsoft reports versus how Sony reports, and what content is in those reports is different, and therefore there are things that you can't pick out of them. And I spent time this week going over the Form 10K for Microsoft and the Form 20F for PlayStation, looking a little deeper at things that they had reported for their fiscal year findings. And so in more personal computing, I think it has right here. In fact, so more personal computing includes Windows and devices. And so it's their OEM stuff. It's not their enterprise stuff. It includes the gaming division, and it includes essentially Bing, right? The stuff that they're doing with search and advertising. Nowhere in their SEC filings are you going to find things other than revenue. Trying to remember if other than revenue attributed to a division. And so you can't tell like how profitable Xbox is, right? Unless they make a comment somewhere about it in their slides, which they typically don't. You can tell how profitable the more personal computing segment is, which is an aggregate of multiple divisions. When you look at the PlayStation reports, and they call it G&NS, so gaming and network services, that is all PlayStation, right? It's PlayStation hardware, it's PlayStation's hardware and peripherals, it's PlayStation software, it is PlayStation Plus and network services. There's maybe a dollop in there of like anything that they're still doing, like in the PC space, like because what that division became was the division that was responsible for the PlayStation Network. When the PlayStation Network broke in 2011, that was being run along in a division along with the guys who did EverQuest. And after that, basically the PlayStation guys who were kind of coming up, right, and rising in power at the time said, yeah, no more, like we're not doing that again. And that division was collapsed into the PlayStation division. So there's probably like a single digit percentage of financial data that could be ascribed or is particular to like that effort, however much of it left is going on, which I think is almost zero. But basically when you're looking at Sony's G&NS financial report, you're looking at all PlayStation, right? When you look at Microsoft More Personal Computing, you're looking at Xbox combined with Windows OEM. Think about the millions of Windows devices, OEM devices sold, which includes every laptop on the planet. It includes obviously Surface, and then you combine that also with what Bing is doing, which I would almost think that Bing was maybe their biggest growth component within the division, minusing the acquisition. So it's incredibly difficult to get at pure Xbox numbers unless they specifically break them out on slides. What I will say, since gaming revenue grew 10%, Xbox content and services grew 13%, up 12%, driven by growth in first-party content and Xbox Game Pass. Xbox hardware revenue declined 22%. So I'm not really getting entirely, but what I'll say is, the trend over the last 3 years, right, 2020 to fiscal year 25, 24, and 23, is that the gaming division was at 15 billion, and then after the acquisition, it jumped to like 21 billion, and then this year, I think they're at 25. I can't remember. It's like just below 2 billion increase from the previous fiscal year. So, to me, what that clearly means, given the declining hardware over time, is that clearly they are making more and more and more. And we know that Game Pass made 5 billion. And so from the comment a couple of years ago in an interview that it was 10 to 15% more, it was 10 to 15% of their total revenue. That put it at about like 3.3 billion ish. And so we know that in a couple of years it's grown by like 1.7 billion ish. So clearly their big increase, right, is you tack on the acquisition revenue, right, coming over from Activision, which is all software, right? We know that their hardware is declining. And so what that means is that as they grow, whatever growth they're experiencing, that's almost entirely from software, right? And a small dollop, right, from services. And so, my question is, goes to, if you think about Xbox and the ecosystem in the business, right, you have a shrinking hardware piece, you have a slightly growing services piece, and you have a significantly growing software piece. Because the install base of Xbox is relatively small in comparison to the 134 million people that are over on PlayStation, the 150 million people that are on Nintendo who are currently going through some type of through a generational transition where you're going to have a mix, and then I'm just going to call it the 130 million people that are on Steam. I'm not going to worry about like jerking everything else into it from PC. But my point is that you have 150, 280. You have like 400 million plus, right, core gamers that you're really talking about that are really driving the business, who are not on Xbox hardware, right? Surely you can have some intermixes of people who own like multiple sets of hardware, but essentially, right, for the sake of the discussion, you have 400 million people that are off your hardware. You're significantly increasing software revenue while your hardware is shrinking. And so what that clearly means to me is that more and more and more as Xbox evolves, more and more of their revenue is being driven off of Xbox hardware, right? More and more of that revenue is coming from the 400 million plus people that are not on your hardware. And so then when you look at the landscape, right, of what we've traditionally thought of as the console space, where you have one of the three competitors who is a smaller and smaller piece of the pie, has become a smaller and smaller piece of the pie across 2 generations. And you look at what's coming next, and let's just go with the theory that the next Xbox is a hybrid PC. My belief is that thing is going to be more expensive than your traditional $500 console. You have a PlayStation 6 that is probably definitely going to be more expensive than a traditional $500 console, and you have a Nintendo Switch 2 that is more expensive than the last Nintendo Switch was, and really more expensive than kind of your traditional Nintendo hardware has been. And so I've often sharply disagreed with people who have this notion that gaming will be fine or gaming will actually be better if Xbox steps out of the console space. And so here we are at a point where it kind of where Xbox is going if they go with this Xbox PC hybrid. I've articulated that as this to me is a return to a state of the market that we had in the like late 80s, 90s, where we had this segment of the market that was occupied by things like, and I apologize for people who've heard this from me before, that was occupied by things like the Atari Amiga, the Commodore, the Coleco Atom, I'm sorry, hopefully I didn't say Commodore, the Atari Amiga, the Coleco Atom, the Commodore 64 VIC-20, TI-99, and maybe to a certain extent like the really low end like Tandy machines. Maybe it was the RS-1000. I'm not exactly sure what the model number was, but there used to be this slice of the market that was above consoles from an expense perspective, but below, right, getting a full-blown PC. So number one, I'm actually excited about that part of the market coming back. But, you know, my warning signal to people has been, right, who advocate for Xbox being extinguished from the traditional console market. I'm like, well, we see that kind of now that's where we're going. Like that's just right now going into the next generation is kind of the closest simulation to that we've been to where they're notionally moving upscale and upmarket. And a lot of the three-party political system of competition that we've had for the last 20, 25, 30 years, right? Because, you know, part of the time we had, you know, we had Sega, Nintendo, and then I would call that third party kind of everything else, right? Back in a time where we had like 8 or 9 consoles on the market because we had 3DO, TurboGrafx, Neo Geo, Atari Jaguar, and so we had all these plus that extra segment right above it. So we did just have Sega, Nintendo, but we had a half dozen or so people kind of standing around being that like, you know, third console competitor essentially. And then you go into more of the modern generation or evolution of the market, and you have Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo. Now we're going into the state where it's kind of like it's a 2 console market, right? In terms of like a traditional console market, and this other thing that's going to occupy that space, right, in the in between, right, in the upside down, right, between consoles and PC. And I think what you're seeing is because there's such a spread across the price, in such a stratification of pricing, you're seeing what is essentially equates to less competition, and you see that the prices are going up. And so in that way, I don't think that that's necessarily a good for consumers, right? I think consumers would benefit from 3 console vendors going in a more head-to-head, right, competitive space. I think a thing to think about too is, will the market support that? Because when I look back and I think about it, and I talk about kind of the pre-2000 time, right, where we had the two bigs and this cluster of six, but the market wouldn't support that cluster of six, right? That's why Sega wound up bouncing out, right? And in fact, right, you might almost argue that well, by the time Sega bounced out, we had PlayStation. So really, kind of what the market was signaling at that point was, you could argue that the market was signaling that it was only going to support two vendors, even though I've always stridently said we need three. I now have to think back and say, I don't even know for certain that the market has really said that it'll support three. Maybe the market is only really willing to support two. Then again, you go into this space where, right, you had three console vendors, fighting it out kind of tooth and nail. And we kind of had that for one generation. But then even you go into Gen 8 and you have like the wonkiness like of the Wii U, of Nintendo kind of coming in and out of the dance. And then you had a lessening of Xbox, right, at that point. So we may want to think about, I may want to think about, because I'm the one who's been saying, hey, we need three, right? We need three people going toe to toe, right, tooth and nail. The reality may be that the market may not actually support all three, right? That the market is really only willing to support 2.5-ish. And then we have to think about, like, what does that mean for consumers? I dovetail that on to, what does that mean if you're an Xbox gamer? As you see this transition of kind of like where Xbox is making money. And my belief is that, at least in my head, the people that I equate as being diehard Xbox fans are people who are on the hardware. But as Xbox, and I've said for a while, when Xbox started publishing its games over to PlayStation, it's going to be an interesting inflection point, right? When the table turns and, Amy Hood and Carolyn Dybeck Hape are looking at the fact that more money is coming into Xbox from PlayStation, Nintendo, and PC than is coming in from Xbox. And what does that mean for the gamer? Your real participation in the Xbox ecosystem. Well, let me back up. What I'm really trying to say is, how are we defining the Xbox ecosystem? Because now we're defining it less and less and less by hardware. Now that's an interesting point. Aaron Moss brings up the comment, what about Steam as the third, taking Xbox's spot? And so that is an interesting concept to consider. If between Valve and Xbox, they are able to flatten the wrinkles that console gamers have always perceived between console and PC. I think the Steam Deck does a really good job of that. There's still kind of some PC-ish stuff that you have to deal with Steam Deck, just because I feel like overall, from a reliability and maintainability perspective, it is not as reliable, right, in terms of getting software updates as a console is. Like a console getting updates, like I never have to worry about. Every once in a while, I have like a snit with the Steam Deck where it loses network connectivity or it doesn't complete the thing, and I have to reboot it or whatever. It's not a big deal. It's like very, 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 very small, but it's not zero. But in general, it does a really good job of kind of flattening out those wrinkles, right, and making it feel like a console-like experience. That's on a handheld. I think things, you start to encounter a higher degree of system complexity as you move up in size and form factor, and functions and features that people are trying to pack into whatever that appliance, right, or system looks like. And so I think that jury's still out on whether or not they're going to be able to entirely flatten that experience. I think both Steam and both Valve and Microsoft are making efforts in that direction. it just remains to be seen, how well they're going to do. The ROG Xbox Ally will tell us a lot about how they're able to achieve that and how close they're able to get to a console experience, and how the market will respond to that, right? If they really believe it, and then if they buy it. The belief thing is a huge part, and I think it often gets bypassed, right? And what people think the uptake of like the ROG Xbox Ally will be, or even once, if we go down the route of it's a Xbox PC hybrid, and even if we go down the route of it's there are multiple types of devices made by the usual suspects of the laptop vendors, right? So Samsung, Alienware, Dell, HP, Lenovo, Acer, and Asus, right? And yes, I know Alienware is owned by Dell, but I still separate them, right, in conversationally, because they make SKUs that are specific to those brand names. It's kind of like Yeti and Ozark, right? They both come off the same production line, but when you get to the end of the production line, like there's a big stamping machine that stamps them one way or the other, and some go off to Amazon and Dick's Sporting Goods, and the other ones go off to Walmart. You buy them for $9.99. So even if we go right into that type of world and environment, I often talk about, like, when we make gaming predictions, we always need to like think back to history. And I normally base any predictions that I do make, I normally base on history, right? I don't base them on, like, unless there's like objective, clear evidence of like how things are different. Like when I used to say, I don't know that the PS Vita is going to succeed, because we have clear evidence, right, that the market is shifting to, everybody has a smartphone now. And now you're going into the space where you're providing kind of the same level of entertainment, to a certain extent, as far as at least the way people see it, and saying, hey, buy this extra thing. Yeah, we know you have to have a phone, and we also had tablets at the time, but buy this extra thing. That's a case where I'll say, well, maybe past history of like how successful the PlayStation Portal was, doesn't predict how the Vita is going to do. In this instance, right, history and how people have perceived these types of things in the past, I think, matter. And so I always go back to, when Microsoft tried to do netbooks, they tried to do Surface RT, they tried to do ultra mobile PCs. And in particular with Surface RT and with netbooks, those things ran a different version of Windows than what you would normally get like on a laptop or a desktop. They ran Windows, I think it was called Windows 7 Starter, right, on netbooks. And I think Surface RT had something similar. I guess it was just called Windows RT, WinRT, I think is what it was called. And so customers would have a problem, right, when they went to that thing and it wouldn't do the exact same thing and run the exact same software that other Windows did. That word of mouth started getting around, and people disbelieved, right, any notion of the vision, right, that you could essentially, there were workarounds and you could do the same thing, right, as anything else, but people just didn't believe it. This is why I think Chromebooks also haven't taken off, even though Chromebooks, I think, are a great fit for 97% of what your average user does. There's a certain disbelief, right, that thing can functionally fulfill the space of a laptop, and so, right, it hasn't taken off. So a big part of this flattening of wrinkles is you don't just have to do it, you have to message it, and you have to convince people and make them believe it, because you're not trying to appeal to the hardcore PC gamer who gets it and knows this stuff and knows the workarounds, right, and understands what they're getting, like in a mini PC, and is okay with that. You're trying to appeal to console gamers who have a history of pushing back on the notion of PCs out of the belief that they're more expensive or more complicated. And so to me, it doesn't matter if you just do like a commercial spot that shows it, like however you do it. And I don't really know how you solve the problem, but you have to convince users. And I think that's a more complex problem than just, having people on a podcast, right, demo the UI, or speak on that, hey, this thing is really great and it'll fit your needs. It's a huge challenge and problem to overcome the inertia of history and what people have convinced themselves of. It's not impossible. We used to all pop popcorn in Jiffy Pop, right? You used to buy the thing in the little aluminum pan with a handle on it, but and eventually people like became convinced of the wonder of the microwave, right? And then now we all do things in microwaves, right? So it's not impossible, but it is difficult and it is challenging. So we'll see how that goes. But like I said, the landscape I think is interesting, and potentially challenging, right, as we go down. And we've already seen like a rise in prices, and there's other things to ascribe that rise in prices to: tariffs, economic uncertainty, supply chains. I think we're seeing a big, significant kind of inflection point and changeover of fabrication lines, and where TSMC. I think TSMC in particular. I feel like every time I read this stuff, I feel like what I'm hearing from TSMC is like they're just tired of I don't know, maybe giving people bargain deals, or people hanging on to asking them to do things on old processing nodes, or whatever it is that's driving it. TSMC has said, look, like, we're going to, right, if you want this new node, right, you're going to pay for it. And that's why you see, Apple obviously being the first one who's really jumping feet first into 2 nanometer. I think AMD not far behind. Surprisingly, out of nowhere, MediaTek is early to the game on 2 nanometer. But I just think TSMC, right, and shortly behind them, Global Foundry and who's the other fab? Samsung, right, are going to be charging more money for components, particularly your high-end, high-performing components. And that's going to exacerbate, right, these rising prices. So like I said, that's the two console or 2.5 console landscape. I'm talking about what is the Xbox ecosystem for an Xbox gamer. That's becoming more and more like software and services. And if, like I said, if you go down the path to like now the thing that you're playing on that is an Xbox is a thing that's not made by Xbox, that just kind of changes where your participation in the ecosystem is. I also think, outside of software and services, there's kind of an erosion on Xbox's placement in the landscape, right, in the areas of peripherals and a storefront. And the storefront thing, I think, is really important to talk about. Peripherals, little ragged edges there. I know that I am starting to transition off of like Xbox controllers being my primary controller on PC. 8-bit do has I pronounce it 8-bit do. I don't know if it's 8-bit do or 8-bit do, to be honest. But the 8-bit do Ultimate Wireless Controller 2, which comes with a charging dock, which has always been a particular nit of mine with Xbox. As far as I know, I don't think they've ever produced a first-party charging dock where the 2.4 gigahertz receiver is actually hidden in a little compartment underneath the charging dock. So you actually just hook the charging dock up to your PC. And then it takes care of charging it and also establishing the connection. But we're in this space now where, again, if you talk about like where does Xbox occupy space, particularly from a brand equity perspective, I can't remember the last time that I saw an Xbox controller in the most sold peripherals on the NPD chart. Now that may be because they don't report it. I don't know exactly. It seems like they definitely report. Piscatella now puts out a chart that tells you what companies are reporting for the different segments. I haven't looked at 8-bit do. Okay, gotcha. In 8. But I haven't like dumpster dived into that to see if Xbox reports peripherals. I don't know if he has a chart for peripherals. I think he has a chart for software. But my point is, I'm trying to think about like where does Xbox have a footprint on the landscape when you talk about, because they say this thing of we want you in our ecosystem. I'm trying to think through how are you in like the Xbox ecosystem, right? As they evolve and we go down the road, that becomes less and less hardware. I think we're seeing like a retreat kind of in their prominence, right, in the peripheral space on Xbox. And I used to, well, it wasn't Xbox, but even way back in the day when it was Microsoft gaming, I used to also love Microsoft controllers, like the Sidewinder series. I had the little Sidewinder Strategic Commander, which was this little pod that you would use to control RTS games. And then they had flight control systems. They had multiple types of controllers, including this one that was it had like a ball and socket joint between two halves of the controller. You would use it as a first-person shooter controller, and you could twist and rotate the thing to be your mouse pointer and play first-person shooters like that. So, but at any rate, my point is that there's less and less hardware right on console. There's less and less peripherals. And then I want to talk about like the storefront. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. The storefront foot placement on PC isn't huge. It isn't popular. It isn't particularly well liked amongst PC gamers. And so, right, if I kind of divide, the 5 places of brand equity and footprint in the console PC, right, whatever this market is that we're talking about, is, shout out to the 90s PC peripherals. Yes, yeah, I miss the Logitech Flight Commander, I think it was called. I can't remember, but it actually had like motors inside the joystick to provide the resistance, as you were flying the plane or flying the spacecraft. But anyway, you could reminisce all day. But these 5 places of kind of toeholds, right, are footprints in the console PC gaming land space, and more for Xbox, that is really boiling down to just software and just services. And so it's going to be interesting to see, right, as they try and mount up this thing, if they go down the path of doing this Xbox PC hybrid. And this comes to where we talk about, right, the differences in how they're going about any notion of a multi-platform effort on PlayStation. And I keep coming back to what's important for PlayStation and where they make a lot of their revenue is things that are sold through their storefront. They have 80 million consoles, and they have people buying things solely through that storefront for those 80 million consoles, right? Plus whatever people are continuing to buy on PlayStation 4, which I think now is down to kind of like DLC and microtransaction type stuff, but it's still generating money. And so, when we talk about, right, we go back to this thing of like what games, right, are going to other platforms. I continue to believe that it's important for PlayStation to continue to sell consoles, to continue to have strong reasons for customer acquisition, strong reasons for customer retention, and for the occasional customer defection, right, that may occur, because that storefront, I think, holds much more sway in their sphere right now from a revenue generation standpoint than either the storefront on console, because you don't have as many people on your install base, or their one on PC, which looks more and more like that is really the one that's going to become more important to Xbox, to the gaming division, right, over time than their one on console. E8 says, when you realize they don't really make new flight sticks anymore, my SciTech flight sticks from 2008 is still being sold today. Yes, but they are now Logitech flight sticks. And for a moment in time, the moment in time that I really gasped and worried was when they became Mad Catz flight sticks. And I was like, okay, now quality is about to go through the bottom. So fortunately, Mad Catz didn't screw with SciTech a lot when they owned them. And then Mad Catz was bought by Logitech and then squeezed out of existence. Although it's very funny, the Mad Catz brand still exists and was purchased by a company in China that now makes actual Mad Catz peripherals. So they have a website you can go to where you can actually buy Mad Catz PC peripherals. E8 says, exactly, Logitech, that storefront generates them a massive amount of money, and in fact generates like the bulk of the purpose of selling the consoles is to get you the access point, right, installed in your home, so that becomes a continuing place, right, where you buy content and stuff. Let's see. I was going to talk a little bit about Xbox and PlayStation guidance and subscriptions. I'm not going to get into it too heavy, but just a note. Xbox. Amy Hood is predicting down revenue for the gaming division for Q1 FY24. I don't think they issued annual guidance for gaming at Microsoft, because again, gaming is just a subset of MPC. I didn't see if they issued annual guidance for MPC. I think Microsoft just issues annual overall guidance. PlayStation I think put out. I'm not absolutely positive. I think they put out a 6.5% reduction in revenue um, guidance for FY26 for G&NS. And so I think an important thing to like think about and look at as we go throughout this year is where is that coming from? Like, what does that bleed off, and whether or not that's a continuing outlook uh, within the Xbox gaming segment? Because they don't, like I said, I don't think they issue annual guidance for the gaming piece solely as a standalone. And so you're going to have to watch it quarter to quarter and kind of just see how it goes. But, Matt Piscatella has mentioned, in the current economic environment where there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, we had GDP in the U.S. shrink, I want to say for the first time in a very long time, right? And so even though there's been all this fear, unknowing, and doubt and wailing and gnashing of teeth of how bad the economy has been, GDP has actually continued to slightly increase each quarter until most recently. I can't remember if it's this last quarter or the quarter before that we did actually see a reduction in GDP. And then you have kind of the tariff lunacy just right in terms of like uncertainty that it's casting. And so Piscatella's outlook was that, look, we're seeing an increasing amount of money being spent on subscriptions. I think Game Pass is going to become more attractive to people as this year goes on. I think you're going to see slight upticks maybe reported in EA Play and Ubisoft Plus. I think there will be a lot of people who are like, oh, that's a good thing. Like the plan is working, Xbox figured it out. But I think the thing that we need to think about at an industry level is, well, what does that mean? That probably means that people are spending even less money, right, on standalone titles. And they may be spending less money, right, on gaming overall. They may be buying fewer peripherals. They may be buying fewer consoles, even though, right, Nintendo Switch 2 has its projections for, what it's going to sell on Nintendo Switch 2. I think that's, maybe starting to look shaky just as you look around the entirety of the industry and look at what people are projecting. The software space appears to be projecting well. Like EA, just recently came out with its earnings reports, and Andrew Wilson reported everything looks rosy, and it's Tiffany couplings for them. So we'll have to see how that goes. But I think kind of a wary eye we should keep on the industry and just see if we're coming off layoffs. A lot of people have said that wasn't the last wave that we're going to see, but I think some of us had hopes that it was going to be the last ones that we saw kind of en masse. Like when you talk about like in very close proximity, you talk about PlayStation laying off people, Microsoft laying off people out of the Xbox division, and then layoffs, going off, like additional fireworks and dominoes around the rest of the industry. I feel like it when you look at a lot of the other layoffs that have occurred at other places, I feel I could be wrong. I feel like I've seen less and less kind of studio closures outside of the big publishers, and then their layoffs have kind of I hate to use the word tapered, but you see a lot of layoff reports that are like, well, we laid off 10 people. Well, we laid off 16 people. Well, we laid off, and I'm talking about organizations that are like hundreds of people, right? Are single digit thousands of people, right? Talking about, hey, we've laid off like, a few dozen people. That's still impactful, but it's not the wholesale of like, we've slashed 50% of our staff. And so I think we had this hope that a lot of that was kind of quelling down. I think it's important to kind of look at, well, but the big two are projecting lower earnings, and what does that mean? That probably brings me to a point that I should probably bring up, because I think people forget it, and I actually had some Xbox people before the acquisition who challenged me on it. But the Xbox and PC space generate somewhere between 90 and just north of $100 billion now, right? And maybe less, right? It slides back and forth when you look at mobile and who's reporting it. But let's just call it 90 and slightly north of 100. PlayStation makes about $31 billion of that. Xbox now makes, we'll just call it $25 billion of that. As I told people before the acquisition, what that means is that you have the two biggest, and Tencent, I believe, I don't have the chart up, but I believe Tencent makes even more than them. And so regardless of Tencent, even before the acquisition, we had the state of the industry where the top like 10 companies in the industry made something like 67%, right, or more of the total revenue. And so that means that for the remaining members of the industry, the publishers, right, that there's an incredibly small piece of pie comparatively for them all to divvy up, right, amongst themselves, including Nintendo. You now have this state where the two big platform owners make over 50% of what comes out of the gaming industry, the console and PC gaming side of the industry each year. And I mentioned this thing about consolidation, right? And I talked to also now about like, when you look at Xbox, that more and more of their money is solely coming out of services and software. You have more and more of that money, right, being made off platform for Xbox. And so, again, I kind of look back at, things that I've said about consolidation and how there are aspects of it that can be bad, right? We now have this state where two people are making over half of the revenue available in the industry, less and less of the pie available for other people, right? Massive layoffs, and now looking at going into the next generation where I don't think we're positioned to be at really kind of the three console state of affairs and landscape that we have historically been. And we're seeing, right, indications and warnings that prices for hardware across those three competitors are going to be like not insignificant, right, in terms of like the value prop and the cost of entry that is going to be present to a lot of gamers, and I think that's going to have an impact. So we'll just have to kind of see how that goes down. I think that is, yeah. I mean, we talked about the differences of what's covered in the NPC segment at Microsoft versus what is reported at PlayStation. So we could go over some news. I didn't have the news prepped that I wanted to go into. So I'm going to bring up a couple things that I did want to briefly talk about, but in the chat, if there's anything else you guys wanted to go over, please go ahead and feel free to bring it up. We've probably got about 11 more minutes kind of in the live stream. So one thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is Gamescom and Future Game Show, kind of what we know about it and a couple of the data points that we are aware of. Let's see. E-Nate says, yeah, I think the layoffs seem to be slowing down. Yes. I'm trying to not use those exact words, E-Nate, because I don't want to jinx anything, but yes. Nerd says, news-wise, there's a much going. I think Epic had a good day in court. Yeah, actually, there's for today, yes, but actually this week was packed chunk of news. Actually, as I was laying out the agenda, I was like, there's no way I'm going to get around to everything. But we can talk about the Google Epic stuff very quickly. Have you watched any of the coverage from you? I haven't personally. I'm not. Like, I play fighting games, Ghostface Kill, but I'm not like that level. Like Wolfgang Mushima is into that, like really hardcore. I don't track Evo. I will pay attention to when like announcements come out of Evo, because lots of times new game announcements will come out. I haven't seen any of that yet. I haven't been maybe tracking it that close, but and nerds wanted to talk about Google Epic and the Play Store. I think that's a pretty quick news story, nerd. So I'll actually flip to that because I think that could be covered very quickly. Because unfortunately, the small delta that happened is actually I feel like tells me what's going to happen with this case. But looking over at Reuters, this news story by Mike Scarcella, Google loses U.S. appeal over App Store reforms in Epic Games case. Alphabet's Google on Thursday failed to persuade a U.S. appeals panel to overturn a jury verdict in federal court order requiring the technology company to revamp its App Store Play. The San Francisco-based Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, in a unanimous ruling, rejected claims from Google that the trial judge made legal errors in the antitrust case that unfairly benefited Fortnite maker Epic Games, which filed the lawsuit in 2020. I think I'm not going to go entirely through this. What I read earlier today, and then double checked over on The Verge, is that basically Google is trying to overturn. What Google wants is they want an injunction, right, to trying to make sure I articulate this correctly. Google wants to get the whole thing turned off, right? The court has said, hey, Google, you need to open up this court has essentially made the same ruling that the European court has made for Apple, right? You need to open up your Play Store. You need to provide people an alternate means of payment. You need to allow developers to provide that alternate form of payment and tell people that they can go get these things cheaper and so on and so forth. Now, the thing that's a little weird-ish with Google is what gets caught up in this, it seems like, is a lot of the dialogue about installing apps and like you've always been able to sideload apps on Android. So where you go get the games isn't as big of a problem, although Google is trying to stand on the same square that Apple has and say that, well, it's, coming through our app store gives you higher security. And yes, there are, nefarious apps that you can pick up from the Play Store, I think, a little more easily than you can from Apple. Apple would have you believe that there's zero chance of getting a problem app out of the App Store. That is not entirely true. It's very small. But it is there. Like, look, you always have to be prudent about what apps you download from the stores. In the Play Store, I have found you need to apply the same type of logic that you use when you buy something from Amazon. So, like, if you go to Amazon and you're going to buy a thing and it only has it's a 5.0 star, but it's only 59 reviews, and then you go look at those 59 reviews and they're all one-word reviews, or a dozen of them sound eerily similar, warning bells should go off that maybe that's not actually a 5.0 level product. Kind of in the App Store, the same thing, right? If you see a highly rated app, but the number of reviews isn't great and they all sound the same, or they're not they're not all written in English if you're buying from the US App Store, then that's a thing to look at. If I track this correctly, the Court of Appeals rejected Google's effort to just get the whole thing overturned and thrown out, because what they were told was we were told, hey, you have to make these fixes in place in 2 weeks. Their appeal, it was kind of we need an appeal to put a stay on this so we have time to come up with our actual appeal. And I want to say what they were given was 1 extra week. And I was kind of okay, when you go to the judge and say, hey, we can't get this thing done in 2 weeks, can we have some time? And the judge says, yeah, you can have another week. I think you're kind of understanding where the judge is going to come down, regardless of you even filing your appeal. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes. I don't know if people are proponents of Tim Sweeney's and and what he's trying to do. I do think that there have been positive things, pro-consumer things that have come out of this overall effort. But I also think that the effort is less altruistic than Epic would have you believe. But I also think that's fine, because Google and Apple are super Machiavellian companies, right? Who are riding horses for their own benefit and have done some shady things. And I'm not a huge opponent of the App Store business model, or the Play Store business model. But where I clap out, right, in backing them up is when Apple says, hey, we'll be compliant, and then does a bunch of stuff to make it this draconian web of Byzantine maze work for an app developer to actually offer alternate payments or put their app off store. I'm Apple has essentially thumbed its nose at the court and said, yeah, whatever, we'll do what you asked us to do. And in doing so, they've done what the court asked them to do, but made it more complicated for app developers to actually take advantage of that. And I'm you guys should have just told the court you didn't want to do what they wanted, So It's kind of hilarious. Nerd says, I think we can weaponize the self-serving interests of one bad actor to minimize the monopoly. Yeah, yes, yes. I think that's what we're agreeing to, and I think where I land on is like when you like you either do that and don't feel bad about it, and you're kind of like a Robin Hood like mentality, like in supporting Epic, or you do it but you feel a little dirty that in order to stop the gangs from fighting, right? You had to shoot right some of their lieutenants, right? And so you don't feel good about that, but you agree that it had to happen. Yes, we're on the same page, Logic. Yeah. Future Game Show 2025. So I think this will be the last, maybe close to the last thing we go over. This news story over on Games Radar by Dan Dawkins. Future Game Show 2025. David Hayter and Maggie Robertson to host Gamescom Showcase on August 20th. David Hayter and Maggie Robertson will host the Future Game Show at Gamescom, which is set for broadcast on August 20th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. The legendary voice actors behind Solid Snake and Lady Dimitrescu will lead viewers through a stacked itinerary of world premiere trailers, developer deep dives, and exclusive updates on the most exciting upcoming games. Innate is in the chat, and I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, Innate agrees with me. The best game show during Summer Game Fest week was the Future Game Show. I think that they have really, it's a really cheesy show every once in a while, but I think it was really good. I think the PC Gamer Show was the only show really at a Summer Game Fest that I felt was horrible. And I feel everything else was just kind of like, acceptable, like what it should be. But Future Game Show, I feel like, has really started putting together a great show. I think that they are showing some particularly good games, particularly when we're in an era of like every game is on Unreal Engine 5, and so every game looks a little samey. The Future Game Show, I think all those games were on Unreal Engine 5, but I think maybe, I don't know how they did it. I think maybe the staff showed a little more due diligence and like spreading out games that kind of looked alike. Because the PlayStation Showcase I watched, and I was like, and like all these games like look the same. And then I had the same kind of deja vu, during I think Summer Game Fest and maybe one of the other shows. So, I think it's good, that they are that they're starting to spread things out, and I think the Future Game Show came off like really well. So this was one that I kind of particularly came across my radar. I think at a moment in time, I had forgotten about the Gamescom shows because I think last year was the first year that Keeley took over and did a keynote at the opening of Gamescom. Maybe he did one before, but I think last year was the first time that it was really big. I had completely forgotten that that's where Indiana Jones was announced as going to PlayStation 5. So, that I think this is now like a thing that we will all be paying attention to and watching like during this week. I used to like Gamescom used to be a thing that I would hear that it was happening and I would hear reports about it, but like now it's becoming a thing where you can kind of firsthand see some of the presentations there from afar, and so I think that's awesome. So comments in chat. I think that Nerds is a perfect co-host. So I think Soil Tech is referring to how the stuff Nerds is offering up for the chat. Nerds says, I'm a little biased. I like the Xbox Showcase, but only because I was at the Fan Fest and I love meeting people in person. Like, so yeah, I mean, again, from a person who was just observing it by video, I think the Xbox Showcase was good. I don't remember, my specific. I've gotten into the mode where I don't critique these shows overly as much anymore, and I don't grade them. The way I look, what I do with these shows is I make a watch list of like every game that I saw that I actually want to keep track of and be aware of, and like track like the launch date and stuff, and check back up on right when I check the Steam page, check if there's any news about it, and as long as I see, and I apologize we didn't go over the Nintendo Direct tonight, despite the fact that I'm wearing the hat. as long as I see like a effective number of games out of it and feel like I didn't like waste my time for like the 40 minutes or whatever, then that's like good enough for me. Like I don't like I kind of articulated for the Summer Games Fest, which is like they're either games are like egregiously out of bounds, like I thought the PC Gamer Show was, or they really stand out from the other shows, or they're just a show, right? Which is what I would expect. I do remember like the thing that I really liked from the Xbox show was I really liked Clockwork Revolution. And I think that's the thing that I am most looking forward to, right out of that production pipeline and studio. E8 says Fax loved FGS, so Texas yin and yang. So I think that's all I wanted to go over tonight. It was actually much less news oriented because we talked a lot about like the Xbox PlayStation stuff, which is actually not my particular preference in how I put the agenda together, but because I had less prep time than I had expected, we just went with that. So we will be trying to do this again on Tuesday. And so we will see how that show gets put together. Gaming Forte, who a lot of you guys know, is doing a live stream now. Yeah, has been doing a live stream actually for about an hour, playing Death Stranding, which should be hilarious because no pun intended, but I don't know that Death Stranding gameplay and mechanics are necessarily his forte. So enjoy that. In fact, I will do my best. Yep, I will actually drop a link for his live stream in the chat. I think that'll work. But I'll be back Tuesday night trying to do the next episode of the Logic Files, and we'll be pulling together hopefully more news-oriented stuff. Hopefully, there won't be a ton of like platform ecosystem evaluative, discussion that we need to have. It says Clockwork Revolution was my highlight from the Xbox Showcase. I completely agree. I was highly anticipating that game being shown at the Xbox Showcase, before we knew exactly what the lineup was going to be, and I was very happy to see it. Very happy to see it land. So I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Soil Tech. I appreciate you guys in the chat. And look, a lot of you guys specifically, right, were part and parcel of the body of people who kind of encouraged me to do this. I still struggle, right, doing it every once in a while before going live of like, am I going to be able to put together like anything, worthwhile for people to listen to? Oh, crap. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, you're on Thrifty next week, right? Yes. I think I have that on my calendar, but I had absolutely forgotten about it until you mentioned it. I think it's August 6th, right? But yeah, it's the first week of August, so yeah, I will pick that up and remember it. Thanks you so much for swinging by and mentioning it because I was absolutely off my radar. I've got a bunch of other appointments for stuff next week, and it was not a lot of logistic stuff popping off, so I had completely forgotten about it. So thanks very much for mentioning it. So for everybody who happened to swing through the chat and attend the live show, I appreciate you. Thanks so much. Soil Tech, thanks so much. Ghostface Killa, Nerds of Legends, Aaron, and E8. I hope I didn't miss anyone. And for anybody who happens to come by and watch the VOD of this and watch kind of the rerun on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content for people who are kind of becoming regulars of the show. Please keep an eye out on my Twitter Twitter account, and on the YouTube front page. I will do my best to always post kind of when the next show is coming up and any adjustments that I need to make in the schedule. But I appreciate you guys as well. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast, which goes down at 8 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday night. So please feel free to join us then. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.